Okay, everyone, we are moving right along here. We've talked about mail flow, we've talked about hygiene, and now we're going to talk about client access, which is an equally important part of the Exchange ecosystem. So why don't we go ahead and just dive right in. So in terms of Exchange and client access, well, what is it? Very simple way of defining what this is a way of using a client application to access your email and mailbox features. That's a nice definition of it, sure. But truly, what does this mean? So remember, we looked at where the mail is and how it goes and flows through the organization. But again, it's only useful if a user is able to access it. That's the purpose of email, of course. We're looking at productivity and communications here, and we need to be able to have our users be productive. So we need to be able to have a nice interface for them to utilize and be able to access the information that's stored in their user mailbox. Well, that's where we're coming into the options that are available to us in Office 365. We've already looked at several of them, but we're going to look through essentially the top one here, and this is going to be the most important one that we're going to be dealing with here in lab this time. But we're looking for Microsoft Outlook for desktop. Okay, so Outlook for desktop is your traditional method of on a desktop computer. This is the thick client where it's actually installed on the computer and it's part of the Office install. And what it does, it works in many different formats. And we're going to talk about one thing called Autodiscover, which is probably one of the most important pieces of this entire puzzle. Because Autodiscover is the lifeblood of how clients connect to Office 365 or just really to their mailbox. That's really all we're going to talk about. But when it comes down to it, Autodiscover is the most important part of this entire experience. But using Outlook for desktop, well, it uses the Outlook Anywhere service. So this is a service that Microsoft has published that is essentially going to allow us to be able to access, as the name implies, Outlook Anywhere. Now, on-premises was a little bit bigger of a deal because this means we could have the same experience on both sides of the firewall. Well, again, in Office 365, we're almost always on the other side of the firewall. So Outlook Anywhere is pretty much just the standard, really, when it comes down to it. Now, we also have Outlook on the web or Outlook web app. Outlook on the web is what it's called now. That is the official name for it. It has been rebranded. It used to be referred to as the Outlook web app or OWA, which you'll see quite a lot of service and references to when we're talking about it. But for instance, as you can see here, it actually uses the OWA service, which is a virtual directory that users can go to have the web experience. It's a little bit lighter of an experience. There's no persistent client or anything like that. We've already looked at the web app, Outlook on the web. We've already looked at that in the mail flow where we were testing the transport rules and all of that. We already looked at those. And that's great because that took care of a lot of the functionality. Now, I'll be honest with you, Microsoft has come a long way. The OWA app or Outlook on the web was always a light version of email functionality, and with the more modern functions and features of a modern web browser and modern web directories, we have the ability to make it actually, I'll be honest with you, it's a very similar experience using Outlook on the web versus the Outlook desktop app. They're very similar. We have all of the same functionalities or most of the same functionalities as we did with both. So we can drag and drop attachments. We can save emails. We have pretty much full functionality over everything. You know, as we saw in there, we can open up shared mailboxes. We can do all of that. We don't get a lot of functionality through auto mapping and such, which you will see when we log in with our Geddy Lee account, what that actually looks like. But again, the Outlook desktop, Outlook web app, they're very similar nowadays, which is a good thing, of course. Microsoft Outlook app for mobile devices. So this is a fun one here, is that Outlook app for desktop is different than the mobile device one. This one in particular is very unique in how it connects, and you do require, in order to understand how it works, it does require a very in-depth knowledge of how mobile devices connect, but in particular, this one here works in a much different scenario, especially in a hybrid environment. And unfortunately, that is just outside of the scope of a little too complex for what we're talking about here. But this is the actual Outlook app for iOS and Android. This is when you go to the store, Google Play Store or Android, or excuse me, the iOS App Store. You go to it and you download the Microsoft Outlook app. This is available to you. This is a different connection, a different interface than what traditionally we would see, which is Exchange Active Sync, or EAS, for mobile devices. This works here with the native clients. So the native iOS client, if you go to the Mail app on there, or in Android. Android's a little funky when it comes to mobile devices, mainly because there's so many different methods for it there's like 80 different flavors of Android iOS as it stands, not iOS, excuse me, the Android operating system as it stands. So it's difficult. But everyone's a little bit different, but these are all native is what they're using. So they will sync with the native local calendar and they will use the native functions. The Outlook app is contained within the app itself. Now, we talked a tiny bit about this in the Intune section where we can set up some of the app protection policies. Well, that's one of the reasons and the more benefits of using the Outlook app is we can make it more secure versus ActiveSync. Now, ActiveSync uses Exchange ActiveSync, or EAS. That's the service that it uses, and it is still very much utilized. You know what? It depends. I work with my customers on different scenarios. I'm moving a little bit more towards the Outlook web app, the Outlook app for mobile devices nowadays because it's easier to containerize data to be a little bit more secure. But again, you got a lot of options, of course. We also have POP, IMAP, and Relay. When I'm relaying, that's just relay devices that are relaying off of Exchange. We talked a tiny bit about this here in the transport lecture, in the mail flow lecture, but looking at all of the options we have here, there's so much. And honestly, it's not really worth your time and effort to understand how POP and IMAP works. Because it's just not a modern connection. Yes, there are secure versions of it, but there's going to come a point here, and this is probably a big piece, to have a conversation around is October 1st, 2022, Microsoft is shutting off legacy authentication, which IMAP, POP, and several of these legacy authentication types are going to be shut off, and they will only be able to connect in a modern format. The reason being is, well, we'll get to that here in a minute, but why don't we talk a little bit about the authentication pieces. So when we're looking at all of these services that we talked about here, OA, Outlook Anywhere, Exchange Active Sync, any of these services here, when we're looking at them, all of them use the same port. It's all port 443, which is the HTTPS port. It has to be secured by a trusted SSL certificate. So you have to have a trusted certificate installed on the Exchange server for your device to be able to trust the connection and to be able to secure it end to end. This is the reason why these used to be different services. Outlook Anywhere, Exchange Active Sync, these used to be completely different services, and we can specify different ports, different ways to connect and such. Nowadays, everything used has been consolidated. Everything's over 443, and that's how the connections all happen, especially from the Outlook Anywhere. That's a big piece now. Outlook Anywhere is the de facto standard on how the Outlook client connects. There are many ways that it can connect, of course, but Outlook Anywhere is the biggest one. We used to have RPC or MAPI connections, but now everything has been moved to over HTTPS. So we're all using port 443, which is a secure port, of course, and it makes a secure connection. Next, as I said, October 1st, modern authentication is going to be the standard. Legacy is going to go away. What is legacy? Legacy is anything that connects through a simple username and password to log in. So the biggest factor of this here is we're looking at POP connections, IMAP connections, old MAPI connections, legacy Active Sync, Exchange Active Sync, so legacy versions of it. So if you're not using a modern operating system or you're not using those different things there, those are going to be shut off and you're not going to be able to connect to Office 365. Microsoft's been pushing and kicking this can down the road for quite some time here. They drew a line in the sand and they said, we are done. As of this day, we are pulling this Band-Aid off and we are going to move on because this is not secure. Legacy authentication is a simple username and password to log in. Why is that not secure? Well, again, a username and password can be cracked. We know that. Simple brute force certainly can be done. In this instance here, we may have to also potentially look at man-in-the-middle or breach replay attacks. These are big deals because, again, with a simple username and password, I'm sending that traffic to Office 365. It's relatively easy to listen in on that traffic. And I can replay these if I know a authentication session is coming through there. I can replay it and potentially look at it. But the biggest, most important factor when it comes to legacy authentication, it does not support multi-factor authentication. That right there, as we have said, and if you've watched the security section, you should know immediately, MFA, if it's not done, forget about it. You're going to be hacked in no time. That's just the way it is. So one of the main reasons why Microsoft is pulling that Band-Aid off is for this reason here in particular. It's just not secure. So how do we connect and how should we be connecting? Well, for the vast majority of us, we're already connecting via modern authentication. Modern authentication is a little bit different in how it works. It doesn't actually use a true username and password. A very simple way, and again, this is one of those that start diving into the technicalities here, is the simple way of doing the difference between modern and legacy authentication is legacy is a simple username and password, where modern authentication is using token-based claims. So these are certificate-based. You have a token, just as if you do when you're on premise to an Active Directory domain controller. Type in a username, password, you get a Kerberos token. Or excuse me, a Kerberos ticket, which is a token that you use to pass to different instances inside your organization. Same instances are going to apply here. We're going to use a much more secure method as we're authenticating against that token. We eliminate that idea of breach replays as well as man-in-the-middle attacks because tokens are based off of sessions. Sessions are device registered as well as IP address registered, and all of those things that we looked at in the audit logs there and the sign-in logs, those are all based off of your token. If you were to try and replay that, again, you cannot, unless the device that you're on is compromised, which sure it could be, but unless somebody on the outside trying to replay some of these packets that are going back and forth through it, it's going to be discarded because it's not going to be able to work. So token-based claims themselves, when users are authenticating with it, we have, it is just inherently more secure. And that's fine. But what else do we get with it? All of those advanced security features that we talked about. You remember when we talked about Azure Active Directory Premium Plan 2, the identity protection, risky users, risky sign-ins, all of those things that were happening, as well as multi-factor authentication, conditional access, all of those pieces there. Well, we have the ability to utilize them inside of modern authentication. So, big difference between all of these here. But when it comes down to it, there's so many different other functionalities inside of the client access service here where I want to actually just take this time and let's jump right into lab. Let's start configuring the Outlook client. First we have to download it if you don't have it, but then let's configure the Outlook client here and start working through some of the sessions that we can set up inside of our Outlook service here. So thanks for this one here. We will jump straight into the lab. So thank you again.